Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Twilight Prisoners, The Rise of the Hindu Right and the Fall of India, by Siddhartha Deb, narrated by Shawn K. Jain. Introduction. One recent summer morning, I found myself looking for an Indian city that appeared to have vanished. I was in Delhi, arriving there not long after a brutal wave of the pandemic had sent even well-to-do Indians scrambling for oxygen cylinders and hospital beds. Now, as the public health crisis seemed all but forgotten, I made plans to travel to the North Indian state of Uttar Pradesh, epicenter of the pandemic and heartland of Hindu nationalism. In order to orient myself as I worked out a tentative route from Delhi on Google Maps, I looked for the city of Allahabad, one of the oldest and most significant cities in Uttar Pradesh, sited on the banks of the notionally sacred and utterly polluted Ganges River. It wasn't there. Once an important locus of India's anti-colonial struggle, home to the Nehru family that produced 3 prime ministers in post-colonial India, Allahabad had entered a period of decline decades ago. But decline is one thing, disappearance another. How is it possible that a city of 1.8 million people could have ceased to exist without my hearing a word about it? But there was no Allahabad on Google Maps, no matter what I tried. Instead, occupying what looked suspiciously like the same pixelated spot on the screen was Prayagraj, an entity I'd never heard of before. Clarity came, eventually accompanied by a sinking feeling. Allahabad, founded by the 16th century Mughal Emperor Akbar, had been renamed for its notionally Islamic associations, and in a perfect convergence between Hindu nationalism and global capitalism, the new Hindu nomenclature had been made official by Google. History had been rewritten, and barely anyone had noticed. The erasure of the past and the rewriting of the present is a feature everywhere in our embattled times. But its most powerful and its most successful iteration is in India, under the Hindu right government led by Narendra Modi. Unnoticed by the West because of its hubris as epicenter, whether of history or of the end of history, the myth-making unleashed by Hindu nationalism in India has achieved almost total success, transforming material as well as virtual reality, dominating the physical landscape while also taking possession of the hearts and minds of a significant section of its population. It is the most successful right-wing phenomenon of our times, bridging Western fascism from the early 20th century with the multiple overlapping digitally inflected authoritarianisms of our era. This should not be surprising. Hindu nationalism is unrivaled in its capacity to bide its time. It outlasted the colonialism with which it collaborated during British rule. It outlasted, too, the Nehruvian decades of decolonization, during which it lurked in the slimy undercurrents of political life. It emerged into the open only when the moment was right, at the turn of the 21st century, when the left had been defeated globally and the market ruled over all. During that dawn of the new millennium, a new millennium that now, just at the beginning of its 3rd decade, already feels tired, old, and disorienting, Hindu nationalism came into its own. As the country was eviscerated by capital, both Western and domestic, erasing all memory of left, anti-colonial, and third world ideals, stamping out any sense of alternatives to a homogeneous, soulless globalization, Hindu nationalism inserted a mythical past that would offer a sense of belonging even as the plunder went on. The high-rises and the highways, the rich in their towers and the poor dispersed everywhere, were, it insisted, not just weak simulacra of the monochromatic world being ushered in globally, but the trace of something unique, a Hindu utopia stirring into life after millennia of oppression. This was the promise embodied by Modi as the most eloquent representation of Hindu nationalism when he became Prime Minister in 2014. Handed an even more resounding electoral victory 5 years later in 2019, he moved swiftly to further this Hindu utopia by changing the constitutional status of Muslim-majority Kashmir, by revising India's citizenship law in such a way that only Muslims were affected, and by rushing to complete the construction of a massive temple to the Hindu god Ram in Ayodhya, a small pilgrimage town in Uttar Pradesh. At the height of the pandemic, to which his government had responded primarily with a lockdown that sent millions of low-wage workers back to their villages on foot as they attempted to outwalk starvation, he appeared in Ayodhya to lay the foundation stone of the temple, the event broadcast live onto a billboard in New York's Times Square. In spite of a stuttering economy and the precariousness that had been starkly made visible by the pandemic, Hindu nationalism retained the sense that its time is now. It was in order to understand that triumphal sense of a toxic nationalism arriving at its moment, to investigate its claims that the outline of a Hindu utopia was being put in place, that I traveled to Ayodhya that summer, an account of which is given in this book. I have been writing about Hindu nationalism and India for a very long time. My first freelance piece for a Western publication, banned in Benares, for the now-defunct Lingua Franca, covered the Hindu rights attack on the historian D.N. Jha for his meticulously researched monograph, Holy Cow, Beef in Indian Dietary Traditions. That piece, however, appeared in November 2001, shortly after the terror attacks of 9/11. In the coming months and years, the eye of Western media would focus not on Hindu fundamentalism, but on Islamic fundamentalism. And this was the great enemy that had emerged from the thawing that followed the Cold War, the new scourge of democracy and of markets. Hindu fundamentalism was a sideshow in this Manichaean conflict, a minor feature in a nation turning out to be a useful ally in the new global war on terror. I saw this in the reactions of some of the white editors who took me out to lunch, vaguely well-meaning, puzzled by my denunciations of the market, India, and Hindu nationalism, their fleeting anxieties about the Hindu rights links with European fascism and the Nazis, papered over by its solidly anti-communist, market-friendly, and yogic credentials. It wasn't just the Western media. The Indian elite, mostly upper caste, upper-class Hindu, in positions of power in technology, finance, media, and publishing, stayed quiet through those decades. With the notable exception of Arundhati Roy and Pankaj Mishra, no major Indian writer with access to Western platforms thought it worthwhile to critique either Hindu nationalism or the market forces that together were beginning to transform India into a dystopia. A genocidal massacre of Muslims in Gujarat in 2002, where Modi had just become the chief minister, was more or less allowed to vanish from memory, as India became the ideal non-Western nation, an entire nation playing the role of a model minority. As a fierce scourge of Islamic fundamentalism and rival to China and Pakistan, and as a wildly enthusiastic convert to capitalism, India was the right kind of rising power. My last nonfiction book, The Beautiful and the Damned, 2011, was a counter-narrative to this account, and an exploration of the nexus between Hindu nationalism and neoliberalism, and of the violence lurking underneath the techno-shine of consumerist Delhi and Bangalore. It was an outlier, a glut of India books, articles, and talks, whether by Indians, diaspora Indians from the UK and the US, or white Western experts jetting in and out of the new airports, offered wildly enthusiastic, improbable accounts of a new India that had finally awakened from decades of post-colonial sloth. The East is a career, the 19th century British leader Benjamin Disraeli had said. It serves as an epigraph in Edward Said's Orientalism. In the glow of the new millennium, lit up by cluster bombs coming down on Afghanistan and Iraq, India was a racket, thriving at literary festivals and leadership summits, at business conferences and university panels. The national election in 2014 that made Modi prime minister did not change the thriving careers of those working in the India industry. He was enthusiastically welcomed on the national and world stage, including by liberals who relentlessly attacked Roy and Mishra, and me as well, for their naivete and disconnect from India's arrival into glory. It was only after Modi's second electoral victory in 2019, when the war against Islamic fundamentalism had begun to fade from the public discourse, when globalization lay in tatters under Trump and Brexit, and when India's mask of promise had slipped off completely to reveal billionaire oligarchs, Hindu nationalist thugs, and a dysfunctional economy, that a few India and Modi boosters began to reinvent themselves, as longtime critics of Modi. The Western powers nevertheless remained steadfast in their admiration for Modi and his political party. In the summer of 2023, as the air quality in New York briefly resembled that in New Delhi, Modi appeared on a state visit in Washington. The welcome from Joseph Biden was consistent with previous overtures from Barack Obama in 2016 and by Donald Trump in 2019. Addressing a joint session of Congress after being serenaded at the White House with an a cappella rendition of a Bollywood number, Modi went home satisfied, freshly recertified as a Democratic leader by the U.S., and with a defense deal for 31 Predator hunter-killer drones in his pocket. This book is an account of this past decade and a half and the pivot from seeming promise to undeniable disaster. A collection of essays and reported pieces, it is a narrative of how a nation and a culture widely celebrated as a success story at the turn of the century suddenly revealed itself to be an authoritarian dystopia, how what was called India shining in the new millennium became a perpetual pollution-laced twilight. But while this book is about India, it is also about much more. It explains that India should be understood neither as part of the rising industrial capitalist complex of Brazil, Russia, India, China, BRIC, nor as a late but diligent newcomer to the Anglo-American capitalist democratic system that is the seeming endpoint of history. It instead reveals how India is connected to Russia and to the United States, to Brazil and to Britain, not in terms of trickle-down prosperity, but in how they all mirror, with variations, toxic nationalism, environmental disaster, precarity ranging from the middle classes down to destitution for those at the very bottom of the social ladder, and a degraded media, arts, entertainment, education apparatus whose loud, constant outpour conceals its utter lack of original thought and empathy. We start with Narendra Modi and his rise from obscurity as a Hindu right paramilitary member to world leader. This is followed by two pieces about the convenient negation of memory that formed a prehistory to the project of complete erasure being carried out by the Hindu right today. The first is about Bhopal, site of the 1984 industrial disaster that stands as the worst such incident in world history, conveniently forgotten by Union Carbide, Dow Chemical, and elites in India and the United States. There will never be an HBO show called Bhopal. The second is about a hidden camp of Burmese dissidents in Manipur, in northeast India, people who were invited across the border by the Indian government in an initial show of democratic solidarity, and who were then vilified and abandoned when they became an inconvenience to the geopolitical ambitions of rising India. The second section is about the mythologies constructed by the Hindu right as it deftly exploited modern technologies, media, market forces, and violence, both state-sanctioned and freelance. This begins with a piece on the detention centers in the state of Assam, where the Hindu right channeled local grievances about a porous border into the myth that millions of foreigners were taking over the region, producing a terrifying carceral regime that stripped 1 million Bengali-speaking Muslims of their Indian citizenship while imprisoning countless others. It is followed by an account of my journey to Ayodhya in the summer of 2021 to visit the Ram temple being constructed as the centerpiece of a future Hindu utopia, Ram Rajya, or Ram's Kingdom, that will mirror a fantastic past that never existed. The last piece in this section is an essay on the fantasies of ancient Vedic aircraft and how its modern origins are concurrent with colonialism and the beginning of Hindu nationalism. The final section is about the resistance to Hindu nationalism. This includes figures such as the journalist Gauri Lankesh, assassinated by a foot soldier of the Hindu right in 2017, the BK-16, a group of activists, thinkers, and writers incarcerated under concocted anti-terror charges since 2018, and Arundhati Roy, whose distinctive trajectory as a writer has involved engaging with politics as well as aesthetics, with writing nonfiction as well as fiction, while resisting both Hindu nationalism and global capitalism. The pieces presented in this collection, some are essays and some are reported pieces, also attempt that intersection of politics and aesthetics. just as they try to reveal that Hindu nationalism and global capitalism reinforce and feed off each other. Narrative quests, as much as they are political and investigative queries, are meant for the engaged general listener, with those interested in imaginative possibilities as well as in stark material realities. The pieces here are also in conversation with my fiction, particularly my novel, The Light at the End of the World, in echoing and mirroring that sometimes takes on haunting overtones, as in my visit to a detention center in Assam in 2021, years after Bibi, the protagonist of my novel, had undertaken a similar journey of her own. What this book offers, then, is an account of this darkest of turns in India's history. Because everything happened so fast, one single catastrophe piling wreckage upon wreckage, as Walter Benjamin wrote, this book is an attempt to slow things down, to put things on the record, to reveal that Modi was every bit as reprehensible in 2002 as he eventually turned out to be for some of his liberal admirers in 2019. That the market was not a gateway to greater equality and democracy in India, but a hall of mirrors, distracting us from cruelties new and old, pulsating through the land. It is a report from the frontiers of the unraveling of India's flawed national project, an account of the multitudes who are prisoners, as its midnight promise of decolonization and third world liberation, what Nehru extolled as freedom at midnight, as India became a nation on the midnight of August 15, 1947, transforms into the bitter twilight of oligarchy, authoritarianism, and climate collapse. Most of all, it is meant to reveal that those multitudes, those who suffered and are suffering, those who resisted and are resisting, are not forgotten. As long as there is resistance and remembrance, there is still hope. Part 1. Chapter 1. Nowhere Man. The Violence, Rage, and Insecurity of Narendra Modi. In September 2014, at Madison Square Garden in New York, India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi addressed a crowd of nearly 20,000 people. It was a sold-out spectacle worthy of a lush Bollywood production, with dancers warming up the audience and giant screens flashing portraits of Modi in the style of Shepard Fairey's 2008 Barack Obama Hope poster. There was a revolving stage, a speed portrait painter, and a bipartisan coterie of American politicians, including Senators Chuck Schumer and Robert Menendez, and South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley, who is of Indian descent. When Modi appeared dressed in saffron, a color associated with the ascetic, martial traditions of Hinduism, his first words were Bharat Mata Ki, an invocation of India as a Hindu goddess that translates as for Mother India. The crowd, almost entirely Indian American, some with Hindu tikas dotting their foreheads, finished the line for him. Jai, victory, they shouted. Bharat Mata Ki Jai. Then they broke out into a chant, Modi, Modi, Modi. Modi's hour-long speech touched on every element of the received wisdom about India as a vibrant democracy and rising economic power. He spoke of its special prowess in information technology, and the particular role played by Indian Americans in this. He spoke of India's youthful population, with 65% of its billion-plus people under 35, of Make in India, a program that encapsulated his plans to transform the country into a manufacturing powerhouse along the lines of China, and the ways in which his humble origins and meteoric political ascent served as an example of what might be possible in India today. This address was followed by many similar ones around the world, but it was the first to establish on a global stage an idea that had been doing the rounds in India, in the Indian diaspora, and among Western nations keen to carry out business in India. Modi and India were versions of each other, doppelgangers marching through the world and conveying a new era. Even Barack Obama made the comparison, writing in Time's annual list of the 100 most influential people in the world. As a boy, Narendra Modi helped his father sell tea to support their family. Today, he's the leader of the world's largest democracy, and his life story, from poverty to prime minister, reflects the dynamism and potential of India's rise. Dynamism, potential, rise. These are the states of being captured by the entwinement of India and Modi. In the minds of India's elite, and in that of an admiring, supportive West, India has been rising for a while, ever since it fully embraced Western capitalism in the early 1990s. Modi's Madison Square Garden appearance was but an expression of that ascendance, from slumdogs into millionaires. But Modi was also in New York because of something that accompanies the rising India narrative, the perplexing reality that, having been rising for so long, India is still not risen. In the past 15 years, the top 1% of earners in India have increased their share of the country's wealth from 36.8% to 53%, with the top 10% owning 76.3%. And yet India remains a stunningly poor country, riven with violence and brutal hierarchies, held together with shoddy infrastructure, and marked by the ravages of lopsided growth, pollution, and climate change. Modi at Madison Square Garden then stood for the promise that India's rise would finally be completed, the summit reached. It had not yet been achieved, but he would change that. He would change it because he was an outsider, a man of humble origins, leading a political party, the Hindu Right Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP, that had a few months earlier been given a clear electoral majority, the first time for any Indian party in 30 years. He was at Madison Square Garden to mark this triumph, and to declare himself the new Indian icon for a new Indian century. Modi referred, naturally, to the icon he had supplanted, the one from a previous century. Stumbling over Gandhi's first name, calling him Mohanlal instead of Mohandas, Modi compared Gandhi to the members of his audience, as a person who had lived abroad as a diaspora Indian before returning to India. Modi's Gandhi, however, had nothing to do with anti-colonial politics, mysticism, or nonviolence. Those had been left behind with the old India, as demonstrated by some of Modi's supporters outside the venue. Gathered in large numbers, they heckled and jeered at the Indian television anchor Rajdeep Sardesai for being part of what they saw as the liberal wing of the Indian media, which is ill-disposed toward Modi. To Sardesai's attempts to ask them questions, they responded with shouts of "Modi, Modi, Modi." When he retorted, "Did Mr. Modi tell you to behave badly? Did America tell you to behave badly?" A brawl ensued, some of the men chanting Vande Mataram, or Praise Mother India, while others shouted "Motherfucker." This episode could be seen as an aberration, but the combination of adulation and violence, sanctimoniousness and abuse, is never far from Modi and those who support him. It is, in fact, the essence of his appeal. He is a representative Indian not merely because he signifies potential outsider status, an Indian form of DIY upward mobility, but also because he embodies violent sectarian and authoritarian tendencies, so much a modern man belonging to the new century that he has dispensed with the pacifism associated with Gandhi. One could see that in the jostling bodies and shouting faces gathered around the Indian television anchor. At work, these clean-cut, middle-class Indian men in their saffron T-shirts displaying Modi's face probably exuded deference and respectability, at least toward those they associated with power and wealth. But gathered in numbers, with their puffed-up chests and clenched fists, they replicated what they admired most about Modi, a kind of unmoored nihilism that dresses itself in religious colors and acts through violence, that is ruthlessly authoritarian in the face of diversity and dissent, and that imprints the brute force of its majoritarianism wherever it is in power. During his speech, Modi told the crowd the story of an interpreter in Taiwan who had asked him if India was a land of black magic, with snakes and snake charmers. This drew nervous laughter from the men and women in their professional clothes. The story was in a familiar genre, that of the Indian humiliated abroad, and can be found even in Gandhi's accounts of colonialism and racism when traveling to the West. For Gandhi and his contemporaries, and in fact for all colonized, marginalized cultures, that experience of humiliation had led sometimes to a kind of nativism, a reaffirmation of the superior values of one's humiliated society. But it had also provoked an anti-colonialism that was internationalist in spirit, identifying with other marginalized groups. But Modi was speaking for a new India and to a new India, one obsessed with completing its rise as an economic power. Neither the speaker nor the crowd acknowledged that snake charming in India is an occupation based on caste, and that they were far removed from such livelihoods. They were simply angry and afraid, humiliated that their Indianness could be tainted by such associations, and it is not hard to empathize with that sense of being patronized. But where the anti-colonial, Gandhi-inspired Indian might have worn the snake charmer tag as a badge of pride, the new Modi Indian merely wanted it destroyed. The new Indian instinctively understood the point of Modi's anecdote, which was that it was set in Taiwan, not a Western country, but still ahead of India in terms of modernity. "Our country has become very devalued," Modi said. Cheers resounded through the stadium. The well-dressed professionals at Madison Square Garden united in their common sense of humiliation. Modi waited for the cheers to die down. Then he said, "Our ancestors used to play with snakes. We play with the mouse." The applause this time was deafening. In a twist of a metaphor, Modi had restored the honor of the nation and of all those present. India was not a nation of snake charmers, but of high-tech mouse managers. And Modi understood this, because he too was an Indian driven by rage and humiliation, a newcomer to the system and a latecomer to modernity, a leader who would transform India into a land of Silicon Valley white magic, but who would retain its authentic Hindu core. Listening to the crowd finishing off his call and response of Bharat Mata Ki, he said, "Close both your fists and say it with full strength." The crowd rose, fists clenched, shouting out the promise of triumph, of victory. Bharat Mata Ki Jai. In 1893, more than a century before Modi appeared at Madison Square Garden, a Hindu preacher called Vivekananda arrived in Chicago. The popular version of the story, as told in India, describes him as a solitary, charismatic figure dressed in saffron robes and turban, as he faced the harsh cold and desiccated materialism of the West. The more prosaic, if still dramatic, truth is that Vivekananda had come to attend the World's Parliament of Religions, a sideshow to that year's World's Fair. There were representatives from many religions at the Parliament, hoping to speak to a West relentless in the assertion of its double-barreled superiority, as embodied by Western Christianity and the Enlightenment. Soyen Shaku, one of whose students D.T. Suzuki became the most famous Zen teacher in the United States, came as part of a Japanese delegation. The Sinhalese preacher Anagarika Dharmapala was to represent Theravada Buddhism. Muhammad Alexander Russell Webb, a former American consul to the Philippines who had converted to Islam, spoke on the faith he had embraced. Vivekananda was a remarkable, complex figure, introducing a distinct, modernized version of yoga and neo-Hinduism to the United States. But if his legacy in the West was to be yoga, in India it would morph, helped no doubt by his early death at 39, into a muscular Hindu nationalism centered on the idea that Hindus needed to become more aggressive in challenging both Islam and the West. He became a symbol of the Hindu warrior monk who had gone into the West to conquer it for Hinduism, an idea embodied loudly by Modi in his own self-presentation, especially in the cross-armed pose and saffron turban he affected. And just as Vivekananda, in this popular version, took the battle to the West, so did Modi when he arrived at Madison Square Garden. In India, it took an organization and the onset of race-based nationalism in the early 20th century to give Vivekananda's vision a more sinister touch and ultimately connect it to Modi. Founded in 1925 in the central Indian city of Nagpur, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, RSS, the National Volunteer Organization, took Vivekananda's ideas of Hindu revival a step further, combining them with racial theories popular in the West and drawing inspiration from the Italian fascists and the Nazis. M.S. Golwalkar, who became the chief of the RSS in 1940, wrote approvingly of Germany's purging the country of the Semitic races, the Jews, and urged Hindus to manifest a similar race spirit with Muslims. After India became independent in 1947, Nathuram Godse, a former member of the RSS, assassinated Gandhi for being too...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?